My name's Jake. I'm 27, and I need to tell you about the night my family made me feel smaller than I've ever felt in my life. It was at my cousin's wedding, a big fancy event where everyone showed up dressed like they had just walked out of a magazine. I remember pulling up late in my old, beat-up car, the kind that rattled every time you turned the key, because I had barely scraped together enough money for gas just to make the drive. I had debated even showing up at all, but part of me didn't want to give my dad and the rest of them another reason to say I was too good for the family or ashamed of where I came from. The truth was, I wasn't ashamed of them. I was just tired of being the family punchline. As soon as I walked in, I felt those eyes on me. You know that sensation when a room quiets just enough for people to look. My suit was a few years old, tighter around the shoulders than I remembered, but clean. I wasn't trying to impress anyone. I just wanted to blend in. But with my family, blending in was impossible. I hadn't exactly followed the path they wanted for me. I wasn't a doctor like my cousin or a lawyer like my uncle. I wasn't even what my dad called stable. Instead, I'd been chasing contracts in the tech world, trying to start my own thing, pitching ideas to investors who didn't return calls, and spending nights in tiny apartments working until my eyes burned. To them, it looked like I was wasting my 20s. To me, it felt like I was betting everything on myself and losing more often than I won. Dinner was served, and I sat at the long table across from my dad, who was already in his element, laughing loudly, glass of wine in hand, soaking up attention like a spotlight belonged to him. He'd always been that way, the man who could turn any moment into a performance, usually at someone else's expense. And that night, I was his material. I could feel it before it happened, that prickle in my chest, the uneasy anticipation that I was about to be put on the spot. My dad leaned back in his chair, looked around the table, and then locked eyes with me. That grin of his, sharp as broken glass, spread across his face. Then, with a voice loud enough to silence the clinking of silverware, he said, "He thinks he'll ever be rich. He can't even afford the gas to drive here." The laughter was instant. My uncle slapped the table, my cousins leaned into each other, and even my mom tried to hide a smile behind her glass. It wasn't just laughter, it was the kind of laughter that slices, the kind where you know the joke is you and everyone's in on it. My stomach tightened, and for a second I couldn't breathe. I wanted to disappear, to melt right into the polished wood of that floor. But instead, I sat there frozen, my face hot, my hands gripping the fork like it was the only anchor I had left. Inside, though, something shifted. I'd been humiliated by my dad before, plenty of times. He had a way of turning my struggles into anecdotes for the family to laugh at, but this moment burned differently. Maybe it was the way everyone joined in. Maybe it was because deep down, I knew I was close to something big in my work, even if no one else could see it. Whatever it was, that laughter carved itself into me. And while they clinked glasses and went back to their conversations, I sat there in silence, a plan already taking root in my head, though I didn't even realize it at the time. I left the wedding that night earlier than I'd planned, slipping out while the music thumped and my dad danced with relatives like nothing had happened. My drive home was quiet except for the hum of my old car, the words echoing in my head. "He thinks he'll ever be rich." Over and over, like a challenge. That was the night I made myself a promise, not out loud, not even whispered, but burned into me so deeply I could feel it in my bones. One day, I'd prove them wrong. One day, they'd regret ever laughing. But at that point, all I had was a promise, an empty gas tank, and a long road ahead. After the wedding, things didn't magically go back to normal, not that I expected them to. If anything, that night became ammunition. It wasn't just a one-off comment anymore. It was a story my dad and the others carried around like a party trick. Every time there was a family dinner, every birthday, every get-together, someone found a way to bring it up. "Hey Jake, you make it this time without running out of gas?" Or, "Careful, don't ask Jake to chip in. He's saving pennies for the fuel pump." They always said it with that playful tone, as if it was just family humor. But you can tell when you're the punchline and not a participant. The favoritism in my family had always been obvious, but it grew sharper after that. My cousin Mark, the groom from that wedding, became my dad's golden child. Mark was the model of success in their eyes. Flashy job, big paycheck, and a willingness to remind people of it. Every time I sat in the same room with him, the comparisons came rolling out. Mark's already thinking about buying his second house. Mark's firm wants to send him to Europe for training. Mark just got his bonus. Jake, maybe you should take some notes. They said it like encouragement, but the truth was, it was ridicule in disguise. I tried to laugh it off sometimes, force a smile, nod politely. But inside, it stung. It wasn't just my dad anymore. It was my whole family feeding into this image of me as the disappointment, the underachiever. My mom played her part too, though softer, in that guilt-laced way only a parent can. She'd call me up, not to check in, not to ask how I was doing, but to suggest I take a real job. Jake, your father and I just want you to have stability, she'd say, her voice sweet but edged with disapproval. You're smart, but smart doesn't pay the bills. Why not apply at the bank? They're hiring. And if I refused, if I dared to say I wanted to keep building what I was building, she'd sigh that heavy sigh, the one that said I was selfish, ungrateful, and destined to fail. The more I tried to explain what I was working on, the less they listened. To them, software contracts sounded like code for lazy excuses. I'd talk about late nights coding, pitching to investors, developing prototypes, and their eyes would glaze over before I could finish. But when Mark talked about billable hours or his firm's clients, suddenly everyone was all ears. It was like speaking two different languages, one they respected, one they mocked. Then came Thanksgiving. I remember sitting at that long dining table, the turkey steaming, the smell of stuffing heavy in the air. My aunt asked Mark to say grace. And of course, he slipped in a line about being thankful for opportunities and success. When it was over, my dad clapped him on the back and said, "That's my boy. He knows how to build a future." Then, without missing a beat, he looked down the table at me and said, "Maybe one day, huh, Jake? If you stop wasting your time chasing pipe dreams." Everyone chuckled. My fork clinked against the plate, and I just sat there, staring at the food I couldn't taste. It wasn't just the joke. It was the way no one defended me. No one ever did. My sister avoided eye contact. My mom stayed quiet, and even my younger cousins had learned to join in, laughing along like it was tradition. And maybe it was. What cut deepest, though, came later that night when I was leaving. I overheard my dad talking to my uncle in the kitchen. He didn't know I was standing just out of sight. "Jake's never gonna make it," he said flatly. "He's got no discipline. Too proud to take real work, too stubborn to admit he's failing. He'll end up living off scraps if he keeps this up." My uncle murmured something back, but I couldn't hear it. All I heard was my dad's voice, and it hit me harder than I expected. That was the moment I realized it wasn't just jokes to him. He genuinely believed I was destined to fail. And worse, he wanted me to. My failure validated his narrative, his authority, his control. The more I tried to stand on my own, the more he wanted to see me fall flat on my face. After that, the dynamic only grew worse. Family gatherings became landmines. Every success I talked about, no matter how small, was dismissed. When I landed a freelance contract worth a few thousand, my dad waved it off like pocket change. "That's not a real living, Jake. Call me when you're paying a mortgage." When I mentioned an investor meeting, my mom cut in with, "Don't get your hopes up, honey. You know how these things go." And when I once dared to share that I'd been talking with a company overseas about licensing my software, my cousin smirked and said, "Sounds like a scam to me." It was constant erosion, a drip of doubt, over and over, until I questioned myself every time I sat down at my desk. Nights became heavier. I'd work until 3 in the morning, code blurring in front of me, wondering if they were right, if maybe I was delusional. But then I'd remember the wedding, the laughter, my dad's smirk, and somehow, that sting kept me pushing forward. What they didn't know, what none of them bothered to see, was that things were starting to shift behind the scenes. Slowly, quietly. But at that stage, all they saw was failure, and they never missed a chance to remind me of it. And then came the Christmas dinner, the one where the tension broke in a way I'll never forget. Christmas has always been strange in my family. It was supposed to be warm, full of laughter, presents, and that feeling of togetherness. But for me, it always carried this undercurrent of tension. That year, though, it wasn't just tension, it was the breaking point. I had debated not going at all. My apartment felt safer, quieter, and at least there, no one was waiting with sharpened tongues disguised as jokes. But when my mom called and said, "It would mean a lot if you came, Jake," I caved. I told myself I'd keep my head down, get through dinner, and slip out early. The house was glowing when I arrived, string lights around the porch, the tree sparkling through the window, laughter spilling out into the cold night air. I walked in with a bottle of wine I could barely afford, hoping at least it would look like I was trying. The living room was already full, cousins and uncles in sweaters, kids running around with sticky fingers from sugar cookies. My dad spotted me immediately, that familiar smirk tugging at the corners of his mouth. Well, look who finally made it. Did the car even survive the drive? A few chuckles rippled through the room. I forced a smile, shrugged it off, and handed my mom the wine. Dinner started well enough. I stayed quiet, listened more than I spoke, tried not to give anyone a reason to turn the spotlight on me. But it was inevitable. Halfway through, the conversation turned to money, as it always did. My uncle was talking about his year-end bonus. My cousin Mark was bragging about his promotion, and before long, someone asked me how things were going. I should have known better than to answer honestly, but a small part of me still wanted recognition, still wanted my family to see me as more than a failure. So I told them about a contract I was negotiating. It wasn't signed yet, but it was big, life-changing if it went through. I explained, cautiously, how the company was interested in buying the rights to one of my software tools, how talks were serious, and how, for once, it felt real. For a second, there was silence. Then my dad barked out a laugh, so sharp it cut through the entire table. You hear that? Jake's got another one of his million-dollar deals lined up. He shook his head, grinning as if it was the funniest thing he'd heard all year. Son, we've heard this story before. Don't count chickens that aren't even eggs yet. The table laughed with him. My cousin leaned over to another and whispered loud enough for me to hear. I'll believe it when he shows up in a new car. Even my mom, who usually at least tried to soften the blows, sighed and muttered, Jake, maybe keep these dreams to yourself until they're real. But that wasn't the betrayal. Not yet. That came after dinner, when presents were being exchanged. I hadn't expected much, I never did, but I bought a few small gifts for the kids, hoping at least they'd smile. When it came to me, though, my dad handed me a small box, wrapped hastily in reused paper. Everyone leaned in, already grinning like they knew the punchline. I opened it and froze. Inside was a plastic toy car, the kind you'd buy in the bargain bin at a gas station. On the roof of the car, my dad had taped a folded-up $5 bill. Gas money, he announced, and the room erupted. Full-on laughter, people slapping the table, wiping tears from their eyes. My cousins actually clapped. It was cruel, planned, and public, meant to humiliate, not tease. I stared at that little car in my hands, my chest tight, my throat burning. My mom tried to hide her smile, but I caught it. My sister shook her head, but said nothing. Not a single person spoke up for me. Not one. I don't even remember standing up, but suddenly I was on my feet, the toy car still in my hand. My voice came out low, shaking more with anger than embarrassment. You think this is funny? You really think this is what family is supposed to be? The laughter quieted, awkwardness spreading across the room. My dad leaned back in his chair, smirking, unbothered. Don't be so sensitive, Jake. It's a joke. Lighten up. But it wasn't a joke. Not to me. It was the moment everything snapped. That toy car, that $5 bill, it wasn't just a gag gift. It was proof. Proof that to them, I wasn't Jake, their son, their cousin, their brother. I was the running gag, the failure they could all bond over at my expense. I left without another word. I didn't even take my coat, just walked out into the freezing night with the toy car still in my hand. By the time I got back to my apartment, I couldn't even cry. I just sat at my desk, staring at my computer screen, the car on the table beside me. Something in me hardened that night. Because in that moment, I knew two things. One, I was done letting them define me. And two, if I ever did land the kind of contract I was chasing, they would never see it coming. And then, just a few months later, something happened that would change everything. The weeks after that Christmas dinner felt like walking through fog. Every memory of that night replayed on a loop. The toy car, the laughter, the smirk on my dad's face. I'd set the little car on my desk, not because I wanted to keep it, but because I couldn't stop looking at it. It was a reminder, equal parts wound and fuel. I'd wake up, see it first thing in the morning, and instead of motivating me, it sat like a weight on my chest. I wish I could say I bounced back quickly, but the truth is, I didn't. January was brutal. The contract I'd been negotiating fell through. The company backed out at the last minute, deciding to build their own version instead of licensing mine. I'd put months of work into that deal, pitching, revising, staying up until dawn fixing bugs. And in the end, I got nothing. Just another disappointment. One my family would never let me live down if they found out. Money got tight, tighter than it had ever been. Rent was overdue, utilities stacked up, and there were nights when I had to choose between buying groceries or keeping the heat on. My apartment was small to begin with, but in winter, when the cold seeped through the thin walls, it felt like a cave. I'd sit wrapped in 2 blankets, my laptop balanced on my knees, coding with fingers stiff from the chill. Freelance gigs trickled in, but they barely kept me afloat. Sometimes I'd stare at job postings, bank teller, office assistant, retail manager, and wonder if my family was right. Maybe I was chasing something that wasn't meant for me. Maybe all those late nights, all that stubborn belief, was just foolishness. I'd hover over the apply button more times than I can count, but every time, I pulled back. Because the thought of giving in, of walking into the next family dinner and telling them I'd taken a safe, stable job, made me feel like I'd be handing them victory on a silver platter. The lowest point came in February. My car finally gave out, the engine coughing its last breath on the side of the road. The repair cost was more than the car was worth, and for a few weeks, I walked everywhere, grocery store, bus stop, even meetings. I'd pull my hood up and trudge through the snow, trying to ignore the stares of people in warm cars flying by. And each time, the echo of my dad's voice played in my head. He can't even afford the gas to drive here. The cruel irony was almost unbearable. Isolation set in too. I stopped answering family calls. My mom would leave voicemails. "Jake, your dad didn't mean anything by it. You're too sensitive." But I couldn't bring myself to listen to them fully. My sister texted once, saying she thought the gift was out of line. But even then, she added, "You know how dad is. Just let it go." That was the thing. Everyone excused him, always. And I was tired of carrying the weight of being the one expected to forgive. But in that silence, something began to shift. Small, almost imperceptible at first. With no car, no distractions, and no family pressing in on me, I had nothing left but the work. I buried myself in it. Nights blurred into mornings. I pored over lines of code until my eyes stung, reworked pitches, and started networking in every way I could think of. I joined forums, cold emailed companies, sent prototypes to anyone who would look. I stopped chasing the idea of impressing my family and started chasing the idea of survival, for myself, not for them. It was during one of those long nights, staring at my screen at 3 a.m., that I realized something. All those failures, all those rejections, they'd sharpened me. Every no had forced me to refine my work. Every collapse had pushed me to find new solutions. The ridicule had left scars, sure, but it had also given me a kind of resilience I hadn't recognized before. By spring, things weren't suddenly perfect, but doors began to creak open. A small company overseas expressed interest in my software. They weren't ready to commit, but they wanted to keep talking. A startup in the US asked for a demo. Nothing concrete yet, but for the first time in a long while, there was movement. And in the quiet of my apartment, with the toy car still sitting on my desk, I began to plan. Not just for contracts or deals, but for something bigger. A life where I didn't need their approval. A future where their laughter wouldn't matter. I didn't know how or when it would come together, but I knew this much. The next time they saw me, I wouldn't be the punchline anymore. What I didn't know then was just how quickly everything was about to change, and how the very thing they mocked me for would become the reason they came crawling back. By the time spring melted into summer, I had settled into a strange rhythm, half survival, half obsession. My days were quiet, stripped down to the bare essentials: code, pitch, sleep, repeat. I was still broke, still walking to the store with grocery bags cutting into my hands. But for the first time in years, I felt a sense of momentum building beneath my feet. It was fragile, like the first crack of light under a locked door, but it was there. The overseas company that had shown initial interest asked me to refine the demo. I poured everything into it, rebuilding features, tightening performance, cutting away the unnecessary. When I sent it back, they didn't reply right away. Days passed, then weeks. I tried not to get my hopes up, but when their email finally arrived, my hands shook as I opened it. They wanted a second meeting, this time with their full development team. At the same time, the US startup I'd pitched to ask me to fly out and present. The irony wasn't lost on me. I didn't even have a working car, and now I was scrambling to afford a flight. I maxed out a credit card, told myself it was do or die, and boarded a plane with nothing but a carry-on bag and a laptop that looked embarrassingly worn next to the sleek machines in their office. But when I stood in front of that team and walked them through what I'd built, something shifted. They weren't smiling politely, waiting for me to finish. They were leaning in, asking questions, scribbling notes. For the first time, I wasn't the odd one out. I was the guy with the answers. That summer became a blur of calls, meetings, and prototypes. I was running on fumes, still eating ramen and skipping meals, but doors that had always been locked were finally opening. And with each small success, I felt myself standing taller, not just in meetings, but in life. The sting of my family's laughter dulled, not gone, but replaced with something stronger, a quiet, stubborn confidence that I was on as something real. By August, I landed my first sizable contract. It wasn't millions, not yet, but it was enough to pay off overdue bills, clear the credit card debt, and finally buy a used car that didn't sound like it was dying every time I turned the key. I'll never forget sitting behind the wheel of that car for the first time, the smell of worn leather filling the air, thinking, this is mine. I did this. Not a gift, not a handout, mine. I didn't tell my family about any of it. After Christmas, I'd gone quiet, stopped volunteering updates, stopped trying to prove myself. And strangely enough, that silence became power. They still thought I was scraping by, still whispered about me at dinners I didn't attend, still painted me as the black sheep. But while they mocked, I was building. Then came autumn, and with it, a turning point I never saw coming. The overseas company called again. They were impressed, not just with the software, but with my persistence. They wanted to discuss a licensing agreement. I listened as they explained the numbers, my heart pounding, and when the call ended, I sat there in stunned silence. It wasn't finalized, but if it went through, it would be worth more than everything I'd ever made in my life combined. That was the moment I realized something. My family had spent years defining me as the failure, the joke, the one who couldn't even afford gas. But here I was, sitting on the edge of a deal that could change my life forever. And they had no idea. For the first time in my life, I didn't crave their approval. I didn't need to run back and announce, look, I did it. The thought of keeping it quiet, of letting them go on believing I was still struggling while my world was transforming behind the scenes, gave me a thrill I hadn't expected. I worked harder than ever. The licensing deal stretched on for months. Lawyers, negotiations, revisions, but with every step, it felt more real. And while the pieces came together, I started preparing for the day it would all be official. The day I could stand, not in their shadow, but far above it. That fall, I walked into a family gathering for the first time in months. I didn't say much. I wore the same old clothes, drove the same modest car, and let them believe what they wanted. My dad still threw his jabs. Jake, you working on another one of those magic deals? And the table still laughed. But this time, I didn't flinch. I just smiled, because I knew something they didn't. The laughter wouldn't last forever. And then, one crisp October morning, the call came. The contract was finalized. Signed. Sealed. Worth $4.3 million. I sat there staring at the papers, heart hammering, tears threatening to fall. And the first thought that flashed through my head wasn't relief or joy. It was the memory of that toy car, the $5 bill taped to its roof, and the sound of my family's laughter echoing in my ears. That was the day everything changed, not just for me, but for them too. They just didn't know it yet. When the ink dried on that contract, I thought the hard part was over. In reality, it was only the beginning. Overnight, my life shifted from survival to strategy. $4.3 million wasn't just money. It was leverage, opportunity, freedom. And if there was one thing I had learned from years of being the family punchline, it was how to keep my cards close until it was time to lay them down. The first thing I did was protect myself. I hired a lawyer. Not just any lawyer, but one who specialized in contracts and asset protection. Together, we set up an LLC and funneled the licensing money into it. Then we established a trust. I didn't want a single dollar tied directly to my personal account where my family, or anyone else for that matter, could sniff around. Every move was deliberate, quiet, methodical. If my family ever found out, it wouldn't be because I slipped. I also hired an accountant, a financial advisor, and eventually, even a business manager. They taught me things I'd never known about investments, about minimizing taxes legally, about making money work for me instead of constantly chasing after it. Sitting in those meetings, I felt like a different person. For the first time in my life, I wasn't scrambling to keep the lights on. I was the one with options, the one in control. But I didn't change my lifestyle, at least not right away. I still lived in the same modest apartment, still drove the same used car I'd bought after the first contract. Outwardly, nothing had changed. Inwardly, though, everything had. I could feel it in the way I carried myself, the way I spoke in meetings, even the way I looked in the mirror. That quiet confidence wasn't forced anymore. It was real. And then, slowly, the first cracks started to appear in the family's narrative. It began with small things. My sister called one night, her tone unusually curious. "So, what have you been up to lately?" she asked, as if she'd suddenly realized she hadn't kept tabs on me. I gave her vague answers, just working on some projects, keeping busy, and she pressed a little, but I didn't give in. That curiosity, though, told me something. Word was starting to spread. A week later, my mom left a voicemail. "Jake, your father and I have been talking, and we'd love for you to come over for dinner. It's been too long. We miss you." Her voice was soft, almost rehearsed. Not the usual sighs, not the subtle digs. Sweetness. It was rare, and it set off alarm bells immediately. Then came Thanksgiving, the same holiday that had once broken me with ridicule. I wasn't planning to attend, but my lawyer suggested something that stuck with me. Sometimes, silence is the strongest statement. But sometimes, showing up when they expect you beaten and letting them underestimate you, that's even stronger. So I went. Same modest car, same old suit, nothing flashy. The moment I walked in, though, I could sense it. The air was different. My cousins, usually smug and dismissive, seemed strangely polite. My uncle slapped me on the back and asked how work was going. Not with mockery, but with interest. Even my dad, who usually greeted me with a cutting remark, just gave a nod. I didn't know if they had caught wind of the deal or if it was just coincidence. But for the first time in years, I wasn't met with open laughter. During dinner, my mom leaned in and said softly, "Jake, we're proud of you. We know you've been working hard." I almost choked on my food. Proud. This from the woman who once told me to stop dreaming and apply at a bank. Something had shifted, but I kept my face neutral. I wasn't about to show my hand. The real moment came after dessert. My dad pulled me aside, his tone oddly measured. "So, son, I hear you've been making some moves. Big moves." He didn't say where he'd heard it, and I didn't ask. I just shrugged. "I've been keeping busy." His eyes narrowed, that calculating look I'd seen 1,000 times. For years, I'd been the source of his jokes, the son who proved him right every time I stumbled. Now, for the first time, I could see it in his face. He wasn't laughing. He was assessing. That was when I knew. The balance of power had shifted. They didn't see me as the failure anymore. They saw me as an opportunity. And the same people who once mocked me for every dollar I didn't have would soon be the ones begging for a piece of what I had built. What they didn't realize was that I had already decided I would never let them. Because I hadn't just built a company or signed a contract. I'd built walls, legal, financial, emotional. I was no longer the boy at the table with his face burning red from their laughter. I was the man holding the cards, waiting for the perfect moment to play them. And that moment was coming sooner than they thought. The funny thing about revenge is that it doesn't always need fireworks. Sometimes it's quiet, patient, like waiting for a seed to sprout. And by the time it grows, the people you're targeting don't even realize it's about to choke them. That's exactly how it felt as the months after Thanksgiving rolled on. I kept my life low-key. Same apartment, same car, same clothes. On the surface, I was still Jake, the guy they thought was barely scraping by. But behind the curtain, my world was expanding. My company grew as more contracts rolled in. The licensing deal blossomed into something even larger, and I reinvested wisely. For the first time, I had employees working under me, people who looked to me for direction. It was surreal. The same Jake who used to walk through the snow just to buy groceries was now signing paychecks for other people. And then, right on cue, my family came knocking. It started with my cousin Mark, the golden child. He reached out with a cheerful text. "Hey man, we should grab coffee sometime. Haven't caught up in forever." My gut told me it wasn't coffee he was after. I agreed to meet him anyway. At the cafe, he kept the small talk short before launching into it. He was looking to invest in up-and-coming ventures and thought maybe I had something worth looking at. I sipped my coffee slowly, hiding my smile. That's interesting, Mark. But I'm not looking for investors right now. His face faltered just a bit before he forced a smile back. Sure, I get it. Just keep me in mind. Not long after, my sister called. She sounded nervous, like she was rehearsing lines. She talked about how proud she was of me, how she always knew I'd make it if I stuck with it. Then she mentioned her husband had been laid off, and things were tight. If there's any way you could help us out, even just a small loan, we'd pay you back so fast, she said. I kept my voice calm, even warm. I wish I could, but everything I'm doing right now is tied up in the business. Liquidity's an issue, you know how it is. She didn't, of course, but she nodded along like she did. When I hung up, I sat in silence for a long while, the irony sinking in. The final piece came with my parents. My mom invited me over for dinner again, this time practically gushing over the phone about how she missed me, how the family wasn't the same without me. Against my better judgment, I went. The evening began pleasantly enough. No jabs, no jokes. My dad poured me a drink, clapped me on the shoulder, even asked about my work in a way that almost sounded respectful. But I could feel it coming, like thunder building on the horizon. After dinner, when the dishes were cleared and we sat in the living room, my dad finally leaned forward. Jake, he said, voice low and serious, your mother and I have been talking. We know you've had some success. And listen, that's great. Really. But you know, family sticks together. We've always been there for each other. And now it's your turn to step up. I almost laughed at the sheer gall of it. Always been there for each other? Where were they when I was walking to meetings in the snow? Where were they when I was eating ramen in a freezing apartment? Where were they when they taped $5 to a toy car and called it my gift? But I didn't laugh. I leaned back, swirling the drink in my glass, and said, what exactly are you asking for? My mom jumped in. Well, the house needs some repairs, and with your father thinking about retirement, things are tight. It's nothing crazy. We just thought you could help out, you know, since you're doing so well now. And there it was. The begging. The shift I'd been waiting for. I let the silence hang long enough for it to sting. Then I smiled, calm, steady, almost gentle. I understand where you're coming from. But no, I can't help with that. My dad's jaw tightened. Can't or won't. Won't, I said simply. The room went still. My mom's face fell, her eyes wide with shock. My dad's smirk, the one he'd worn my whole life, flickered for the first time. He tried to recover, tried to laugh it off. Don't be ridiculous. You've got more money than you know what to do with. Don't play games. I set my glass down and leaned forward. Do you remember that toy car you gave me last Christmas? The one with the $5 bill taped to it. My dad's face froze. That was the night I stopped seeing you as parents and started seeing you as obstacles. You wanted me to fail. You laughed at me, dismissed me, humiliated me. And now you come asking for help. I shook my head slowly. No, you made your choice. Now I'm making mine. For once, they had no comeback. No laughter. No jokes. Just silence. And in that silence, I felt something I hadn't felt in years. Power. Not the kind that comes from money, but the kind that comes from finally turning the tables. What they didn't realize then was that this was only the beginning. I wasn't just going to say no. I was going to make sure every single one of them understood exactly what it meant to mock the man who built himself from nothing. The silence in that living room was thick, almost suffocating. For the first time in my life, my dad didn't have a quick-witted jab, and my mom couldn't smooth things over with soft words. I could see it dawning on them, that the son they once laughed at, mocked, dismissed, had slipped completely out of their control. My mom tried first, her voice trembling. Jake, you don't mean that. We're family. We were only joking all those years. You know your father's sense of humor. We love you. I looked at her evenly. Love isn't humiliating your child in front of a room full of relatives. Love isn't making them feel like the punchline of every story. Love isn't standing silent while it happens, year after year. She fell quiet, her face pale, her hands twisting the hem of her sweater. My dad finally spoke, his voice hard, defensive. You're bitter. You're holding on to grudges. We gave you everything growing up, food, a roof, an education. And now you've got money and you think you're better than us? I leaned forward, my tone calm, but sharper than any insult. Better than you? No, but I am done with you. And don't get it twisted, you didn't give me everything. You gave me obstacles. You gave me doubt. You gave me a fire so hot it burned me into the man sitting in front of you now. Every time you laughed at me, every time you dismissed me, every time you told me I wasn't enough, you built me. So if I'm better at anything, it's because of what you tried to destroy." He opened his mouth to argue, but I stood, cutting him off. "Here's the truth. You taught me I couldn't count on family. And now, when you need me most, you can't count on me either." I left them sitting there, stunned and silent. And for the first time in years, I felt light walking out of that house. No more weight on my chest. No more invisible chains tying me to their approval. I was free. Word spread quickly after that. My sister stopped calling when she realized help wasn't coming. My cousin Mark sent one more message about an investment opportunity, but when I ignored it, he didn't bother again. The family dinners carried on without me, but the dynamic had shifted permanently. I was no longer the butt of the joke. I was the ghost of what they'd lost, the reminder of how badly they'd misplayed their hand. As for my parents, they tried a few more times. My mom left long voicemails about forgiveness, about family being all we have. My dad, predictably, left one message where he raged, calling me ungrateful, selfish, a disgrace. But I didn't return the calls. I didn't need to. Their laughter had turned into silence, and that was enough. Months later, I was at a dinner with my team, the people who actually believed in me, who had worked beside me to make everything possible, when I reached into my pocket and felt something small. The toy car. I still carried it sometimes, not as a wound, but as a reminder. I set it on the table, and one of my employees asked what it was. "Motivation," I said simply, and slipped it back into my pocket. And that was the truth. The little plastic car, the laughter, the humiliation, it had all been fuel. They thought they'd broken me. Instead, they forged me. That night, as I drove home in my new car, quiet, sleek, nothing flashy but entirely mine, I realized something. Revenge didn't come in screaming matches or dramatic takedowns. It came in living so well, so far beyond their reach, that they had to choke on the very words they once used to tear me down. And for the first time, I smiled at the memory of their laughter. Because now, it wasn't on me. It was on them. Final line. I no longer carried the weight of their words. Only the freedom of knowing I'd turned their mockery into my empire and left them to sit in the ruins of their own laughter.